Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Marksman Radio. Thank you so much for stopping by to take a listen today. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the concept of defunding the police. We're having a lot of conversations about that currently, especially most importantly and primarily in Minneapolis at the moment. I want to talk about the repercussions of defunding a public service like the police department, some things we should consider or think about when thinking about taking steps about defunding or putting further regulations on the police department. So anyway, that is going to be the basis of this video. So the first thing is first. I do have a family member who works in the education system, public education here in Indiana. And typically, a lot of times we do see a lot of defunding happen as different townships are given different resources, different allocation of funding, and typically changing with the larger populations of the students that are within those school districts. And now what that typically means is the first thing that any type of organization like the school system tends to start pulling back on the levers that they start to pull when defunding becomes imminent is on labor. So that usually leads to two things that we see. Number one is a drop in pay of teachers, or two, a drop in the availability or a drop in the positions that are available. We tend to see consolidations. It's actually something that's happening right now within our local school district, where they are combining the loads of the vice vice principal of the school into two different school districts. So now that vice principal who is receiving the same pay is having to travel between two schools. The other position is no longer there, and now the workload on that person is increased, and the type of service that they can offer their students and their families in those two school districts has also been reduced by half. We don't tend to see dropping in paid salary of administrative type people, or also contractors, food suppliers, any things like that have contracts with the department. Those are usually pretty well entrenched within the organizations, either through contract or relationship, which is a part of the corruption of these organizations. It does exist really on every level, whether it's education, policing, or governmental type positions. Now, if we take that same sort of concept and apply it over to a police force, let's just take Minneapolis Police Department as an example, as that seems to be the hotbed for this sort of topic or scenario. If we were to defund the police, I'm going to talk about defunding and then deregulating, or putting harsher regulations on, I should say. But if we were to defund the police department, we can reasonably assume that the number one thing, the drop or the cuts are going to be either in salary or amount of officers hired. If we talk about salary, of course, we're going to be lowering the hiring standards to get people who are willing to take that position for lower pay, which of course is not going to lead to good outcome. The second thing that it will do is, if we drop numbers, that is going to be less police officers available to respond to incidents in the city, which of course I believe is really the ultimate goal. It's to reduce the amount of police presence in the area. Now, what we're seeing as a reaction to this is sort of what is going to be the countersink or the counterbalance to a lower police presence is an increase in people, volunteers in their own communities, sort of bringing up arms, if you will, neighborhood patrols, community security organizations that will offer protection or security parameters to their own communities. Now, I see a couple problems with this. I think it will lead to an emergence of private security details, so guns for hire, if you will, people who are willing to maintain and patrol those neighborhoods, because of course, if we are strictly relying on the availability of typical working class people to also take up a part-time position in patrolling their neighborhoods, of course, it's going to lead to two issues. One is the flexibility in their time, and two is going to be, if I have a full-time position somewhere, and sure, on nights and weekends, I might want to patrol my neighborhood. If that area starts becoming very dangerous and very risky for me, there's really not a whole lot of incentive for me to stick around and make that, I'll say I'm already getting paid for my job. I really don't need to be going out at midnight every night with a gun, potentially apprehending criminals breaking into homes. It's not something I need in my life, so I'm not going to do that. What it will lead to, though, is people willing to create firms or work for private security details who are willing to make that their work, which of course their own hiring practices, their own training practices, and everything like that is completely up to the discretion of that private firm, unless of course there's regulation put on it. If there's regulation put on those firms, and of course they will become ancillary police departments in and of themselves, but of course more fragmented against different firms taking care of different neighborhoods. I guess there could be a competitive advantage there because of some security detail has become sort of authoritarian, sort of hassling people for no good reason. Of course, those firms by those communities may be disbanded or fired, and other firms hired in their place. So maybe that's an interesting sort of give and take on allowing capitalism to happen with that sort of detail. Now, another aspect of this is the emergence of vigilante type justice. So we have, of course, private individuals taking it upon themselves to come out and police their own cities and suburbs and everything. Do they necessarily have the training to apprehend or take care of people if things like that were to happen? And of course, are they going to have the respect of people within the community to listen to what they're doing and saying? For example, if I'm breaking into a home and some average Joe pulls up in his pickup truck and says, "Hey, I'm the neighborhood watch. You need to stop what you're doing right now," knowing that there's no police department for you to call to back him up, I'm probably not going to listen to what you're saying, because what are you going to do? And in order for Joe Blow, public watch or neighborhood watch to assert his dominance over me in the situation, he's going to have to escalate, draw a firearm, and start shooting at me to get me to stop what I'm doing. Really, how do we break down the societal consequences for doing things if there's no police force around to enforce that sort of thing? So could interactions actually become more violent and worse, leading to more shootings and things like that? Now, an interesting aspect along this vein is the Ahmaud Arbery and the McMichaels. I can't remember their first names, the father and the son, who did pursue an act of vigilante justice to try to apprehend Ahmaud Arbery. He was 25 years old, totally unarmed, who ended up being shot. I think, everybody agrees that that scenario was definitely not what we would want to have happen on a grand scale. You have Ahmaud Arbery, who, as far as we know, walked into an unconstructed home. We do not believe or have evidence to suggest that anything was stolen or taken. He was later jogging, confronted by the McMichaels. An altercation ensued, and he was shot and killed. Of course, the McMichaels are now facing criminal charges for that interaction. Of course, at face value, as far as the information that's been provided, all of us unanimously agree, just like what happened with George Floyd, that the whole altercation was horribly handled and should not have happened, which led to now 2 instances of loss of life, which of course is not what we want ultimately. Now, what's interesting, if we look at the political outcome of the Ahmaud Arbery case, of course, the McMichaels are condemned for pursuing vigilante justice. They should have called and waited for the police. We saw this if we're going back to the George Zimmerman case, which is where, of course, he enacts his own form of vigilante justice, which again leads to another loss of life. So it's interesting to also see the same group of people pushing for or agreeing with the concept of defunding of police departments, because, again, we're going to then see the onset of vigilante type justice, whether through private residents or security firms, who are going to, of course, perpetuate scenarios exactly like this. So it's interesting, when is this okay and when is it not? So that's something to politically keep in the back of your mind. It's all sort of a circus, a dog and pony show, if you will, that you can never, the sides change constantly depending on who is the person in favor of what outcome. It typically seems to be the different organizations championing that cause along with their constituents. So it's really, it's disheartening, and that's what makes politics so frustrating. Now, if we move into the concept of adding more regulation on police departments. Now, this is something I can and I'm more prone to agreeing with rather than the defunding. So the more regulation would be things like regulations on the amount of training hours that are necessary for new hires, regulations on a certain IQ or aptitude test scores or passing on a standardized test for new recruits in police departments, a proficiency and understanding on the use of firearms, non-lethal alternatives such as pepper spray or anything like that, and when to know what appropriate outcomes to take in the situations in which those should be used. Physical restraint such as chokeholds, arm bars, things like that will be no longer used. We're already having sort of a legal repercussions. So if you are a witness to or party to a police officer breaking the regulations, you can be held just as culpable for those regulations being broken, of course, both as far as your position in the police department as well as criminally, and we're starting to see that now. Now, those are conversations that I think are more meaningful and are going to lead to a better outcome to the public overall in that sort of regard. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about this is the outcome or the effect that I think that this will have on the Second Amendment as a whole, as this is a loosely related, gun-related channel that is tied into my main channel on Marksman TV. So again, we're going to have two sort of factions that are going to have to take over responsibilities for security in this country if the police are absent. Number one, again, is going to be security details, neighborhood or community organized security groups, or private people defending their own private property. So in all of those cases, if we have, it's sort of like micro militias of a society, or within their own societies, little micro police forces that are formed. Of course, we're going to have to pull from groups of people within those societies who, of course, will need to be armed. If they're not armed, if they're just walking around with billy clubs and nightsticks, of course, because they don't have the letter of the law behind them, you know, it's going to be really hard to get somebody to agree to be handcuffed and put in the back of grandma's sedan, when you don't have a gun to back that up, or that type of force multiplier to back that up. Of course, most likely a criminal is probably going to have a firearm on them. In most cases they do, whether purchased legally or in most cases illegally. Now, if that is the case, there's going to have to be a wider access and greater availability of firearms. Therefore, I think it is going to be a lot less likely that we are going to agree in the removal of elements of the Second Amendment or the Second Amendment as a whole. And that's going to also include things like the conversation of AR-15s or the quote-unquote assault rifles. It's going to be a lot harder to ban those when we are now placing onus on the community to defend themselves. Of course, we saw this with the infamous rooftop Koreans who had things like Mini 14s. It's been demonstrated time and time again in situations like this where people are without availability of police officers, and we've seen those small instances within rioting scenarios where police can't get to you. Having those firearms available is definitely something that weighs in your favor when you don't have police cars and helicopters and armored vehicles and SWAT teams and stuff to back you up. The big question to ask ourselves is, Joe Blow America, middle America, working person, or the suburban soccer mom, are they going to be happy to relinquish those things now knowing that the police are not there? Typically in instances of gun control debates, a lot of people say what you should do is call the police, allow them to come in and handle the situation for you, which again, I circle back to is exactly what everybody argued in the Ahmaud Arbery case. So we can't have it both ways. Which way is it going to swing? If we dismantle the police department, that's going to be the only outcome that can happen. Well, that's all my thoughts on this issue, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by and listening. Whether you agree or disagree, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Have a little bit of dialogue down there. Thank you again for stopping by and taking a listen. I will talk to you guys next week.